In the last section, we put together a onSubmit handler on our form element. So we defined the prop, we passed it a callback function, and then we saw several times that the callback function was successfully being called. We know that it was being called successfully because when we tried to submit the form, we saw that after we added event.preventDefault, the browser no longer automatically refreshed itself. So at some point in time, onFormSubmit was working just perfectly. But then as soon as we added console log this.state.term, we started to see an error message appear. So in this video, I want to start to figure out exactly why we are seeing this error message. Now I'm going to tell you right now that this error message and the reason for it is going to be the absolute most common error message that you see in every React project you're ever going to work on. Without a doubt, you're going to see this error message all the darn time. So I want to make sure that you really understand why we are seeing this error message and exactly how we are fixing it. Let's first examine the error message itself and get a better idea of kind of the root cause of this issue. So the error message here says, cannot read property state of undefined. This is not a super clear error message, I'll be honest. If I were in charge of writing error messages myself, I would probably rephrase this as something like, I cannot access the property state on the value undefined. Now even that's maybe not the best. So let me give you a quick code example inside my JavaScript console over here on the right-hand side. As a quick reminder, undefined is a value inside of JavaScript. If you ever try to access a property on undefined, such as undefined.state, you're going to get the same error message that we just saw back over here. Cannot read property state of undefined. So what this error message right here is essentially telling us is we are trying to reference undefined.state. But as you can see with our code over here, it says this.state, not undefined. So the root issue here is that JavaScript, for some crazy reason, thinks that inside of this onFormSubmit function, this is not equal to our instance of the search bar class. It thinks that this is equal to the value undefined. That's the root issue here. So to really solve this problem and really understand the error message, here's two things that we have to go through first. We're going to first get a quick review of what the this keyword is used for inside of a class. And then after that, we're going to get a quick review on how the value of this is determined inside of a function. Okay, so number one, what is the value this used for in a class? Here's a diagram of our instance of the search bar that is created anytime that we render a search bar to the screen. The search bar instance has a couple different properties, such as state, render, onFormSubmit. Inside of any code that we write inside of the search bar, we can reference the keyword this. This is a reference back to the class itself. So when we say this, we're essentially saying, give me a reference to the instance of search bar that I am writing code inside of. We can then use that to get direct access to our state, render, or onFormSubmit properties. So for example, I could say this.state, and it will give me access to the state object that belongs to this particular instance of the search bar. And we've already done that several times. Inside of our render method, here is this.state.term. Right here is this.formSubmit. So without a doubt, in some cases, using this works just fine. It seems like the one exception is here inside of the onFormSubmit function. So to understand why it's going wrong right here, we have to get a better idea of how the value of this is determined in a function. To do so, I want to give you a very quick code example that's basically going to exactly mirror the scenario that we are in right now. All right, so I'm going to pull open a quick little code editor that we can very quickly write some code into. I'll put a link to it on the screen in case you want to write some code along with me. So here's a link to it. The address is my full name, Stephen Greider. Notice how I don't have an N in my last name. GitHub.io, not com, it's io, /playgrounds. All right, so here's that editor. Now inside of here, we can very quickly put some code on the left-hand side, like let's say const my value equals 10. And then every time that you put a JavaScript expression underneath that, that results in some value, it'll be printed automatically on the right-hand side. So if I do my value, I see 10 is printed. And then I can do my value divided by 10, I get 1. My value times 999, I get 9990. And if I go and change the original value up here, it's going to update all those expressions as well. So this is just a little tool that we can use to very easily see values printed up for any given expression. Okay, so now let's get a good example of how the value of this works inside of a class and how it gets determined inside of a method. I'm going to create a little dummy class here called car. And inside of it, I'm going to add two different methods. I'll say setDriveSound. That's going to be a function that gets an argument called sound, and I'm going to assign it to this.sound, like so. And then after that, I'll define a second method called drive. And anytime we call that, I'm going to return this.sound. So essentially, it's just a dummy little class. It gives us the ability to set a value, and then later on, return that value. Essentially, that's what's going on, forgetting all the car and drive sound terminology. So now after that, I'm going to create a car with new car. I'm then going to set the drive sound with vroom. So now anytime that I call drive, I'm going to see vroom print up over here. All right, so we now have a good example that makes use of the this keyword inside of a method on a class. So let me now tell you the very important rule to understand. Whenever we want to figure out what the value of this is going to be equal to inside of a method on a class, we look not at the method itself. We don't look at this method. We look at where we call the method. So we look down here. We're calling drive right here. Now here's the rule of thumb. We find the function name. It is drive. We look to the dot to the left of the function, and then we look at the variable that is referenced to the left-hand side. This right here, this is what this is going to be equal to inside of the drive function. So this right here, this.sound, like this, that word this, is going to be equal to the car variable, or the instance of the car class. That is a rule that is going to stand up like 95% of the time in JavaScript. Anytime you want to figure out what the value of this is going to be inside of a function, you don't look at the function, you look at where the function is called. And you look at what is to the left of the dot when the function gets called. In this case, it's car. So when drive gets called, this is equal to our instance of the car. Now I can give you a very good example of this in action. Let me put together another little example here just to make sure that you understand that this is 100% true. I'm going to create an object down here, a simple object called truck. I'm going to give this thing a sound property of put, put, put. And I'm going to rip off the drive function from my class car, or from my instance of car right here. I'm just going to rip the function out of there and assign it to this truck object. So I'm going to say drive. Actually, you know what? Let's be really explicit here. I'm going to say drive my truck. And I'm going to assign that the value from car.drive. And now, underneath that, I'll do truck.drive my truck. So I'm not going to call it just yet. I want you to tell me, what do you think the value will be printed out up here when I invoke this function? Well, what's the rule? We look at this function. We look at what is to the left of the dot. This is what this, or right here. I know using the word this too much here is really confusing, but I know just look at what we have to the left of the dot. That variable right there is what this is going to be equal to inside of the drive function. So when I put the parentheses, we see put, put, put. So it's essentially the same as putting truck.sound right there, as opposed to this. We just take that variable, shove it in for the value of this, and that's it. That's the rule. Okay, so now that we understand the rule, let's really apply it to what is going on inside of our case with the search bar and the form and the onSubmit or onFormSubmit callback right here. Okay, I want to show you a little corner case here with this example. Here's a corner case. What happens if I assign the drive function to a variable called drive? Like so. Notice that I did not invoke drive. There's no parentheses there. I just said car.drive, and I'm going to assign that function to a function, or to a variable called drive. And now down here, I'm going to call the drive function. But before I put the parentheses on there, I want you to guess what is going to be returned. Well, try applying that same rule that we just discussed to this function right here. What is to the left of the dot? In this case, there is no dot. There's no dot and there's nothing to the left of it. You might even say that to the left of the dot that doesn't exist here is the undefined, or it's undefined to the left of the dot in this case. So when I call this drive function now, what do I get? I get truck. Oh, let's revert the code back to what was before. I get cannot read property sound of undefined. A quick question for you. Does that error message look familiar? Does it look familiar at all? I would say it looks pretty darn familiar. Yeah, that looks pretty familiar. So what does this tell you here? It tells you that when we pass that callback down into the form element, at some point in time, we are going to call our callback of onFormSubmit right here. And when it actually gets invoked, there is no like this dot onFormSubmit. There's no search bar onFormSubmit. At some point in time, when the form actually calls that function, it rips that function off of that object or whatever object it shows up as inside that form element, and it calls that function on its own just like this. And so when the function is invoked, the value of this inside of it is equal to undefined. This example you see right here is exactly what is happening inside of our component right now. All right, now at this point, if this is confusing, I encourage you to either rewatch this video or ask a question in the QA. Because like I said, this error message right here, you're gonna see it a billion times. Even when I write React code these days, I've been writing React code for a very long time, and I still run into this problem surprisingly frequently. So if you have any questions right now, please ask them, because you gotta understand this thing, because I guarantee you, you will run into this error message. Okay, so let's take a pause here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to take this understanding about what's going on here and really truly apply it to our form element right here and kind of close the entire circle and make sure that things are really clear. Okay, so quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.